In the year 675 of the Common Era, in the Sogdian city of Panjikent, a boy was born who would spend his life reading the intentions of empires. His mother, Ferengis, was the daughter of a dyer. His father, Farnkund, was a caravan merchant, a man who spent more nights under open sky than under his own roof. Panjikent was small but wealthy, a way station on the road linking Chinese silk to Persian silver and Byzantine glass. From his father's stall, young Vandek watched languages collide: Sogdian, Persian, Turkic, and the sing-song tones of Chinese traders passing through. He was taught to write in the Sogdian script, looping and vertical, borrowed long ago from Aramaic scribes. But his father insisted on more: Chinese characters for the merchants who dealt with Tang officials, and a smattering of Turkic for the horsemen who controlled the passes. At 12, Vandek joined his father's caravan for the first time, bound east toward the garrison towns of the Tarim Basin. The road east was not romantic. It was thirst, sunburn, and the constant fear of raiders. Merchants like Farnkund carried no army, only wits, bribes, and the goodwill of whichever power controlled the road that season. That season, the road belonged to the Tang. Kucha, in the Tarim Basin, held the seat of the Yangtze Protectorate, China's military command for the western frontier. Vandek first saw Tang soldiers here, armored, disciplined, and utterly foreign. It was here that a Tang quartermaster noticed the sharp-eyed Sogdian boy, who could haggle in 3 tongues at once. By 18, Vandek was no longer just his father's assistant. He worked as an interpreter for Tang officers managing trade permits along the frontier. It was steady work. It also placed him, day after day, inside the offices where the empire's frontier business was conducted. Tang China did not merely trade along this road. It fought for it, against the Tibetan Empire rising in the south and shifting Turkic confederations in the north. Tibetan forces had already pushed north into the Tarim Basin once this generation, and Tang commanders knew they would try again. One evening, an officer named Li asked Vandek to stay after the other clerks had gone. He did not ask Vandek to fight. He asked him to keep traveling and to keep his ears open. It was not an unusual arrangement. Merchants had always carried more than goods, rumors, warnings, prices, and now, without much ceremony, intelligence. Vandek said yes. He told himself it was simply another kind of trade. For the next several years, Vandek's caravan routes doubled as intelligence routes: Kucha to Khotan, Khotan to Kashgar, and north across the Tian Shan passes to Turkic encampments. Khotan was famous for jade and for silk weaving, and useful to Vandek because Tibetan agents also passed through it disguised as merchants, just as he did. He learned to notice small things: an unfamiliar dialect of Tibetan spoken too fluently by a wool merchant, a horse shod in a style used only by garrison troops. He drank slowly and said little. Silence, he found, drew out other men's words far better than questions did. What he learned? He did not write plainly. He used a merchant's private shorthand, numbers standing for troop counts, colors of cloth standing for the direction of a threat. The message was sewn into a hem, indistinguishable from the kaftan's ordinary seams. Twice a year he crossed back to Kucha, where the strip of silk was quietly handed to Officer Li, unpicked, read, and burned in an oil lamp. In this way, Tang commanders tracked Tibetan supply movements through the southern passes years before any major campaign began. By his mid-20s, Vandek had married a merchant's daughter from Kucha's own Sogdian quarter, and fathered a son. His double life continued without her full knowledge. She knew he traveled for trade, and that Tang officers paid him well for information about prices. She did not know how far that information traveled, or how dangerous it had become to carry. The work grew more dangerous as the rivalry sharpened. Around 700 CE, Tibetan forces pressed harder into the Tarim Basin, testing Tang defenses at Kashgar. Vandek's caravan route now ran close enough to watch such columns pass, counting spear points from a hillside instead of a tea house stool. He counted in pebbles, one for every 10 men, transferring the total to his coated silk only once he was alone. His reports reached Kucha in time for the garrison to reinforce Kashgar before the Tibetan advance arrived. For this, Li rewarded him with something more valuable than silver, an official pass permitting freer movement along the Protectorate's roads. It made him faster, freer, and, though he did not yet realize it, more conspicuous to those watching the Tang administration from the shadows. One such watcher was Kutlug, a fellow Sogdian merchant whose trade rights Van Dak had unknowingly undercut, and who resented the favor Van Dak now enjoyed. Kutlug had his own dealings, supplying provisions to whichever army paid best, Tang or Tibetan alike. In exchange for protection of his own caravans, Kutlug offered the Tibetan officer something simpler than gold: a name. In 709 CE, on a routine crossing near Kashgar, Van Dak's caravan was stopped, not by bandits, but by a disciplined Tibetan patrol. They searched the goods with unusual precision, as though they already knew what they were looking for. A soldier's blade found the seam in Van Dak's caftan on the very first try. Inside was the coded strip, numbers and colors that meant nothing to an ordinary trader, and everything to a spy. There was no bargaining. Espionage, in either empire, carried the same understanding. Capture meant the end of pretending. He was marched to a Tibetan garrison fort in the foothills, one of the forward posts built to hold the Tarim Basin's southern approach. For 3 days he was held without questioning, long enough, his captors knew, for fear to do some of their work for them. On the 4th day, he was brought before the fort's military governor, a man responsible for the region's defense and its intelligence. Van Dak did not deny that he had carried messages. He denied nothing that could not be denied, but he refused to name Officer Li or describe the Tang network he had served. His silence bought him nothing. In the frontier logic of the time, a spy's usefulness was measured only in what he could still be made to reveal, and Van Dak, they judged, had already given his last useful secret simply by being caught. Sogdian and Chinese sources from this period rarely record the fates of individual informants by name. Men like Van Dak vanish from the record precisely because their value depended on invisibility. But garrison law across both empires treated espionage as a capital offense, and frontier commanders were not known for leniency toward men who had watched their armies from hillsides. Van Dak's execution, so far as later merchants' letters allude to it, was carried out that same morning, quietly, without ceremony. In Kucha, Officer Li never received his final report. Only a rumor reached him, passed merchant to merchant, that a Sogdian trader had been taken near Kashgar and not seen again. In Kucha's Sogdian quarter, his wife waited for a caravan that was overdue, then overdue again, until the waiting itself became its own kind of answer. Kutlug's caravans, meanwhile, moved untroubled through the same passes for years afterward. His betrayal never traced back to him. The war for the Silk Road continued long after him. The Tang would hold the Tarim Basin for another half-century before new powers reshaped the region entirely. What survives of men like Van Dak survives almost by accident. A scrap of Sogdian shorthand, an official's passing note, a name mentioned once and never again. He left no monument. His only legacy was the information he carried and the empires that, for a little while, moved because of what he saw. Somewhere between the pebble in a pouch and the silk hidden in a hem, an ordinary man became, briefly, essential, and then was gone.